Everybody thinks the Indiana Fever's biggest problem showed up on the court Saturday night. Fans watched the missed defensive assignments, the exhausted legs in the second half, the moments where the offense completely stalled out, and they assumed the conversation would end there. Another rough performance, another difficult learning moment for a young team trying to adjust to massive expectations around Caitlin Clark. But what if the real story had nothing to do with the final score? What if the biggest thing happening around the Fever wasn't happening inside the arena at all? Because while Indiana fans were focused on the chaos unfolding under the lights, someone else was reportedly paying attention to something much more important: the cracks forming underneath the roster itself. And according to growing conversations around the league, one of the smartest team builders in women's basketball may already be preparing to take advantage of every single one of them. That's where Sandy Brondello enters the picture, and once you understand her history, the entire situation starts to feel a lot bigger than one regular season loss. This isn't a coach experimenting with random roster moves and hoping something sticks. This is someone who has already built championship teams in multiple cities, someone who understands exactly how to spot weaknesses before other organizations even realize they exist. In Phoenix, she helped construct a title contender around elite star power and turned that franchise into one of the most respected teams in the league. Then she arrived in New York and did it again, helping transform the New York Liberty into a powerhouse that suddenly became the center of the basketball world. Now she's attached to Toronto's expansion project, and according to league speculation, the process may already be underway behind closed doors. Quiet phone calls, waiver discussions, international scouting conversations, the kind of off-season maneuvering most fans never hear about until a rival roster suddenly looks complete overnight. And that's exactly why Indiana fans are starting to get nervous, because Toronto doesn't seem interested in waiting years to become relevant. They're acting like a franchise trying to accelerate the process immediately. And the dangerous part for Indiana is that expansion teams often thrive by stealing the exact pieces contenders fail to value properly. Every overloaded minute from Clark, every exhausted stretch from Kelsey Mitchell, every bench issue that forces Indiana's starters to carry impossible workloads, those moments are more than just game problems, they're information. They reveal roster weaknesses in real time, and experienced executives know how to use that information later. Reports and fan speculation have already connected Toronto to multiple players who were either available, overlooked, or allowed to walk elsewhere. And even though some of those conversations remain unconfirmed, the pattern itself is what has people talking. Because Sandy Brondello has spent years proving she knows how to build winners out of opportunities other franchises ignore. What makes this even more fascinating is how quickly the timeline may be moving. Most expansion franchises are treated like long-term projects. Fans expect years of losing before meaningful success arrives. But Brondello's history tells a completely different story. Everywhere she goes, the turnaround happens faster than expected. That's why so many people around the league are suddenly paying attention to Toronto's early decisions. There's a growing feeling that this isn't just another new franchise trying to survive. This could become a direct threat to Indiana much sooner than anyone predicted. And if the Fever front office isn't careful, they may eventually realize the biggest rival in Caitlin Clark's future wasn't built through the draft at all. It was built quietly, piece by piece, during the exact moment Indiana thought the spotlight was only focused on them. The most dangerous part of Indiana's opening night loss wasn't the score, it was what the game exposed to everybody watching around the league. For months, Fever fans convinced themselves the hardest part was over. Drafting Caitlin Clark changed everything. National television arrived, ticket prices exploded. Every arena suddenly treated Indiana like the main event. But attention and roster depth are two completely different things, and Saturday night may have been the first moment people realized how fragile this entire situation still looks underneath the hype. Because once the pace intensified and the rotations tightened, the same problem kept appearing over and over again. Indiana simply does not have enough reliable backcourt depth behind Clark and Kelsey Mitchell.
And in the WNBA, weaknesses like that don't stay hidden for long. That's what makes this so uncomfortable for Fever fans. While social media spent all weekend debating Clark's performance, rival front offices were likely studying something else entirely. They were studying exhaustion. They were studying substitution patterns. They were studying which players the coaching staff trusted and which players they clearly didn't. Every minute Mitchell stayed on the floor looking drained was information. Every time the offense completely collapsed without Clark initiating the action was information. Even the body language mattered. Experienced executives know how to identify stress points inside a roster before those issues become public disasters. And according to growing speculation around league circles, Toronto appears to be paying very close attention to exactly those details right now.
Expansion franchises survive by finding opportunities other teams miss. That's the hidden part casual fans rarely think about. Most people assume expansion teams are built through flashy draft picks and superstar signings, but historically, the smartest organizations build contenders by collecting players other franchises failed to value properly. Bench scorers, veteran guards, defensive specialists, players buried in bad rotations who suddenly thrive in larger roles somewhere else. And when you look at Indiana's current situation, there may be more opportunities sitting there than people realize. The Fever are under pressure to win quickly because the entire basketball world is watching Clark's development in real time. That pressure creates panic. Panic creates rushed decisions, and rushed decisions are exactly how talented players quietly become available. What makes Toronto especially dangerous is the leadership behind those decisions. Sandy Brondello isn't building this franchise blindly. She has already spent years proving she understands how championship windows actually work. She knows stars alone don't win titles. The role players do, the second-unit guards do, the veterans who stabilize games when the pressure spikes do. That's why there's increasing chatter that Toronto's front office is aggressively monitoring every waiver situation and every roster squeeze around the league. Not because they're desperate, but because they understand timing better than most organizations. And right now, Indiana looks like a franchise trying to balance superstar expectations with an incomplete roster. The scary part is that this process may already be happening faster than Fever fans realize. Some reports and online speculation have connected Toronto to players Indiana either considered, passed on, or failed to retain. None of that guarantees future moves, of course, but the pattern itself has people talking. Because expansion teams don't need 10 stars to become dangerous. Sometimes they just need to steal the exact 2 or 3 players another contender couldn't afford to lose. And if Indiana keeps showing the league where its weak spots are, those opportunities are only going to grow. But this isn't just about random roster decisions anymore. There's a reason so many people around the WNBA take Sandy Brondello's moves seriously the moment her name gets attached to a franchise. And once you look at what she's already done in this league, the entire situation starts feeling a lot more real. What makes all of this feel genuinely dangerous for Indiana is that Sandy Brondello has already run this exact playbook before, multiple times. That's the part many casual fans still don't fully understand. She isn't just respected because she won games. A lot of coaches win games. Brondello built systems that turned entire franchises into championship operations, and she did it faster than almost anyone expected. When she took over the Phoenix Mercury, the organization already had star talent, but the roster still needed structure, chemistry, and the right supporting pieces to actually break through. Within 2 seasons, Phoenix was holding a championship trophy, not because of one lucky playoff run, not because injuries cleared the path. They won because Brondello knew exactly how to maximize elite talent while quietly building one of the deepest and smartest rotations in the league. And that pattern didn't stop in Phoenix. Years later, she walked into Brooklyn and inherited a New York Liberty roster that had talent but lacked identity. The expectations were massive, the pressure was constant,
Everyone knew New York wanted to become the face of the WNBA, but wanting it and building it are completely different things. That's where Brondello separated herself from most coaches. She didn't waste time trying to slowly develop culture over 5 years. She immediately started assembling pieces that fit together with championship urgency. Veterans who understood pressure, stars who could handle attention, role players who wouldn't disappear in playoff moments. And suddenly, the Liberty weren't just improving, they were becoming the most talked about team in women's basketball. What's scary for Indiana fans is how quickly Brondello's timelines usually move. In New York, the transformation happened almost immediately. One major addition turned into another, then another. Before the rest of the league fully adjusted, the Liberty had become a super team with legitimate championship expectations. And according to growing discussions around the league, Toronto's front office appears to be operating with that same aggressive mindset right now. Not patient rebuilding, not slow experimentation, strategic acceleration. That's why every roster cut around the league suddenly matters. Every waived veteran matters. Every unhappy bench player matters. Brondello has built a reputation for identifying value before everyone else catches on. There's also another reason executives around the league pay attention whenever her name gets attached to a project. Players trust her. Veterans want to play for her. International talent respects her connections. That changes everything for an expansion franchise. Most new teams struggle because players don't believe they can win quickly. But when someone with Brondello's resume is leading the operation, that perception shifts instantly. Suddenly, overlooked free agents listen differently. Suddenly, international players become interested. Suddenly, agents start returning phone calls faster. Some reports and speculation online have already suggested Toronto could become a serious destination for experienced role players looking for larger opportunities. And even though many of those rumors remain unconfirmed, the logic behind them makes complete sense.
And this is exactly why Indiana's current situation matters so much. The Fever are trying to build around one of the most watched young stars basketball has ever seen in Caitlin Clark. But the pressure surrounding that process leaves almost no room for mistakes. If Indiana misjudges role players, rival franchises notice. If they fail to protect depth, other teams take advantage. And Brondello has spent years proving she knows how to capitalize when organizations underestimate the importance of those details. Championships aren't built only through superstar headlines. They're built through the invisible roster moves nobody respects until June turns into October. That's why there's growing tension around what Toronto might become over the next 2 years. Because if Sandy Brondello's past tells us anything, it's that when she starts building quietly, the league usually notices the danger far too late. And Fever fans may have already seen the first warning sign without realizing it. The moment that really started making Fever fans uneasy wasn't just the loss itself. It was watching Odyssey Sims walk into Indiana's building wearing another jersey and immediately look like exactly the type of player the Fever suddenly needed. That's what made the entire situation feel so much worse. Sims didn't just have a decent game, she looked comfortable, aggressive, confident. She attacked the floor like someone who already knew Indiana didn't have enough answers defensively in the backcourt. And as the game kept unfolding, social media started filling with the same question over and over again. Why wasn't she still on this roster? Because when a veteran guard comes into your own arena and exposes the exact weakness fans have been worried about for months, the conversation shifts fast from bad loss to possible front office mistake. What made the reaction even louder was the timing. Indiana's biggest issue all night was stability behind Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell. The Fever desperately needed another experienced guard who could calm possessions down, create offense, and survive difficult stretches when the pressure intensified. Instead, fans watched Mitchell carry an exhausting workload while Clark absorbed constant defensive attention. Then Sims shows up on the other side and reminds everyone what reliable veteran depth actually looks like in real time.
That's the kind of performance that changes how fans view off-season decisions almost instantly. Suddenly, people weren't just criticizing rotations or coaching adjustments anymore. They were questioning whether Indiana underestimated the value of players who could stabilize games around their stars. And according to growing speculation online, Indiana may not have been the only franchise monitoring Sims before she landed elsewhere. There's been increasing chatter among fans and LBA observers that Toronto's expansion front office was also paying attention to several veteran guards around the league, especially players capable of stepping into larger roles immediately. None of those rumors have been officially confirmed, but the possibility itself is what's fueling so much discussion right now. Because if Toronto was evaluating the same player pool Indiana passed on, it raises a much bigger question about how differently these organizations may be approaching roster construction. One team appears focused on surviving pressure around a superstar timeline. The other appears focused on collecting undervalued pieces before the rest of the league reacts. That's where the fear starts creeping in for favor fans. Not because losing one player automatically destroys a franchise, but because patterns matter. Championship organizations usually protect depth aggressively. They identify which veterans matter before the rest of the league sees the impact. And when those decisions go wrong, rivals notice immediately. Expansion teams especially pay attention to situations exactly like this because their entire strategy depends on finding players other teams failed to prioritize correctly. That's why the Odyssey Sims conversation has become bigger than just one game. For many fans, it feels like an early warning sign that Indiana's margin for error may be much smaller than expected. There's also a psychological side to this that people around the league understand very well. Veterans talk. Players notice which organizations value stability and which organizations constantly shuffle pieces around, trying to solve problems quickly. If experienced role players begin feeling uncertain about Indiana's long-term structure, that could eventually affect future free agent decisions too. Meanwhile, Toronto is entering the league with flexibility, opportunity, and a respected coach in Sandy Brondello, who already has credibility with veterans across women's basketball. That combination is why some Fever fans are becoming increasingly uncomfortable watching these roster situations unfold publicly. And the truly unsettling part for Indiana is that Sims may not even be the biggest concern moving forward. Because behind the scenes, there are already growing conversations about another advantage Toronto could quietly use against the rest of the league, an international recruiting pipeline that very few teams may be prepared to compete with. What makes Toronto's situation even more interesting is that their biggest advantage may not come from the draft at all. It may come from connections the rest of the league can't easily replicate. Because while most fans are focused on big-name stars and expansion draft headlines, there's another layer quietly forming underneath all of this, an international pipeline that could eventually give Toronto access to talent pools other teams are reacting to far too slowly. And when people around the WNBA talk about this possibility, the conversation almost always comes back to the same two names, Sandy Brondello and her husband, longtime basketball coach Olaf Lange.
This is where things start becoming genuinely strategic. Brondello's roots in Australian basketball are deep, but Olaf Lange's relationships throughout the international game may be just as important. For years, both have operated inside networks most casual fans never even think about. National team connections, overseas club relationships, player development systems, agent networks. These aren't short-term basketball contacts built during one off-season. They're decades-long relationships across international women's basketball, especially in Australia, where some of the toughest and smartest role players in the sport continue emerging every single year. That matters because expansion franchises often struggle finding reliable depth quickly. But if Toronto already has trusted access to international veterans and developing talent, the rebuilding process could move much faster than expected. And, according to growing speculation among league observers, Toronto may already be monitoring several international players capable of fitting specific roster needs immediately. Some names have started circulating online among fans, though many of those rumors remain unconfirmed. What's fueling the conversation is the belief that Toronto isn't just looking for stars, they're looking for system players, perimeter defenders, experienced shooters, smart secondary ball handlers, veterans willing to embrace difficult rotational roles without demanding attention. Those are exactly the types of players championship teams need, and they're often easier to identify through international scouting pipelines before the rest of the league fully catches on. That's why Fever fans should probably pay attention to this now instead of later. Indiana's current roster pressure is happening publicly. Everyone can see it. When Caitlin Clark leaves the floor, the offense changes dramatically. When the bench unit struggles to create offense, the pressure immediately swings back onto the starters. And over the course of a long season, those weaknesses become valuable information for rival franchises trying to build strategically. Toronto doesn't necessarily need to steal a superstar to become dangerous. If they can quietly collect the exact type of disciplined role players Indiana keeps proving it lacks, the balance of power could shift much faster than people realize. The really dangerous part about international pipelines is that they rarely operate loudly. Fans usually don't notice them until suddenly a contender has 6 or 7 perfectly fitting rotation pieces that seem to appear out of nowhere. That's what organizations like Phoenix and New York became so good at under Brondello's leadership. The stars grab headlines, but the supporting structure wins championships. The veteran guard who survives playoff pressure, the shooter who spaces the floor without needing plays called for her, the defender who handles difficult assignments so the stars can conserve energy. Those pieces are often discovered through relationships and scouting networks that take years to build, and Toronto may already have access to one of the strongest relationship networks in the sport before even playing a single game. There's also another reason this matters for Indiana specifically. Expansion teams become far more dangerous when they don't rely entirely on domestic free agency. Most franchises end up competing over the same small group of available players every offseason, but international pipelines create alternative options. That gives Toronto flexibility other teams may not have, especially if veterans begin viewing the franchise as a serious long-term project under Brondello. Some fans online have already started speculating that Toronto could eventually become a preferred landing spot for overlooked international talent looking for opportunity in the WNBA. Again, much of that remains speculation for now, but when respected basketball relationships already exist behind the scenes, those possibilities suddenly feel a lot more realistic. And somehow, the story gets even stranger from here. Because underneath all the roster talk, the expansion rumors, and the growing rivalry tension, there's a bizarre piece of history connecting Indiana and Sandy Brondello that most newer WNBA fans have absolutely no idea about. A connection dating back more than 2 decades that now feels almost impossible to believe when you look at where everyone ended up. Back in 1999, the Indiana Fever were still a brand new franchise trying to build an identity from scratch. The organization was entering its very first expansion draft, searching for players who could help establish the team in the early years of the WNBA. And during that process, Indiana selected Sandy Brondello. At the time, nobody could have imagined how significant that small piece of basketball history would eventually become. Because almost immediately after drafting her, Indiana moved her in a trade that would end up connecting some of the biggest names in this current story. The trade itself sounds unreal when you revisit it now. Indiana traded Brondello away in exchange for Stephanie White, the same Stephanie White who would eventually become one of the most recognizable figures connected to the Fever organization. The irony is almost too perfect. One coach who would later become a championship-winning architect elsewhere was traded so Indiana could acquire the woman who would later stand on the Fever sidelines herself. At the time, it was simply another basketball transaction during the chaotic early years of a growing league. But looking back now, with Brondello leading Toronto into the same conference as Indiana, fans online have started revisiting that history in a completely different way.
Now, to be clear, there's no evidence Sandy Brondello is operating out of some personal revenge mission against Indiana. That part has become mostly fan-driven speculation online because sports fans love dramatic, full-circle narratives. But the symbolism surrounding the story is hard to ignore. The franchise that once moved her away is now potentially standing in the path of another team she's trying to build into a contender. And when people already view Brondello as one of the smartest roster builders in the league, these old basketball connections suddenly start feeling bigger than they probably should. That's how rivalries begin taking on emotional life beyond the court. Fans connect dots, history resurfaces, and every future matchup suddenly carries a little more tension than it otherwise would have. What makes the situation even more fascinating is how differently both organizations now appear to be positioned. Indiana has the superstar spotlight. They have Caitlin Clark, national attention, sold-out arenas, and enormous expectations. But Toronto may have something equally dangerous developing behind the scenes: patience, flexibility, and leadership with proven championship experience. That contrast is exactly why this old 1999 story keeps resurfacing in conversations online. It feels symbolic of two completely different organizational paths colliding again decades later. One franchise trying to survive the pressure of immediate relevance, another quietly constructing a future without nearly the same public scrutiny. And honestly, the timing makes everything feel even stranger. Indiana is under more pressure than almost any team in the league because every game involving Clark becomes national news instantly. Every loss becomes a debate. Every roster issue becomes a headline. Meanwhile, Toronto gets to build in relative silence while Brondello studies the league carefully from the outside. Expansion franchises often benefit from low expectations early because it gives them room to make aggressive long-term decisions without constant public panic. That freedom can become extremely valuable if the people running the franchise know exactly what they're doing. There's also something else people are beginning to notice. Brondello's history shows she tends to thrive when organizations give her time and trust to execute a vision completely. Phoenix eventually became a champion, New York eventually became a powerhouse, and now Toronto appears willing to hand her significant influence over how this expansion project develops from the ground up. That's why so many fans around the league are paying close attention already. Not because Toronto has accomplished anything yet, but because experienced basketball people recognize patterns early. They've seen what Brondello-built teams eventually become when the roster construction starts aligning properly. And while fans keep getting distracted by the old history and dramatic storylines, Indiana may be facing a much more immediate problem right now. Because beneath all the speculation, all the rivalry talk, and all the expansion buzz, the Fever still haven't solved the issue everyone saw on opening night. A roster that suddenly looks dangerously thin whenever the pressure intensifies. At some point, hype stops protecting a team from reality, and for Indiana, that reality may already be arriving faster than expected. Because underneath the sold-out crowds, the national media attention, and the non-stop spotlight surrounding Caitlin Clark, one issue keeps showing up over and over again whenever games become difficult. The Fever simply look too thin when the pressure rises. Not untalented, not hopeless, just stretched too far in too many important moments. Opening night exposed it clearly. The starters were carrying enormous workloads, the rotations tightened quickly, and once fatigue started setting in, Indiana suddenly looked like a team depending on perfect circumstances just to stay balanced. That's a dangerous place to be in the WNBA, because this league punishes weak depth faster than almost any other professional sport. There aren't endless rotations to hide problems. There aren't 15-player benches soaking up meaningless minutes. Every weakness gets exposed repeatedly over the course of a long season, especially when teams start game planning specifically to attack it. And right now, Indiana's biggest vulnerability looks painfully obvious. When Clark leaves the floor, the offense loses rhythm. When Kelsey Mitchell has to create offense late in games while exhausted, efficiency drops. When defensive pressure increases, the margin for error gets incredibly small. Those aren't isolated issues anymore. They're patterns.
What makes this situation especially concerning is how rival organizations are absolutely tracking these patterns in real time. Every front office in the league studies roster stress points constantly. Which players look overworked, which lineups collapse under pressure, which bench units can't survive important stretches. Those details matter because they shape future roster decisions, free agent conversations, and even expansion strategies. And if there's one person people believe understands those weaknesses better than most, it's Sandy Brondello. Championship coaches don't just watch games for wins and losses, they watch for structural problems. They identify where teams may eventually crack under playoff pressure or roster instability. That's why so many Fever fans are becoming uncomfortable with how visible Indiana's issues already look this early.
The workload problem may be the biggest warning sign of all. Clark came into the league carrying historic expectations before even playing a full professional season. Every defense targets her. Every arena treats Indiana like the main attraction. Every possession becomes emotionally charged because of the attention surrounding her career. That kind of environment becomes exhausting over time, especially if the supporting structure around her isn't strong enough to absorb pressure consistently. And when the team starts leaning too heavily on her creation ability night after night, opponents notice quickly. Fans noticed it during stretches last season. Analysts are noticing it again now. The question is whether Indiana's front office fully understands how urgently they need to solve it before the pressure compounds further. There's also another layer to this that makes expansion teams like Toronto especially dangerous. Expansion franchises thrive when contenders become desperate. If Indiana reaches a point where they feel forced to make quick fixes around Clark's timeline, that could open the door for mistakes, overpaying for short-term solutions, misjudging role players, letting valuable depth walk because the organization is chasing immediate results. Those are exactly the moments smart rival executives capitalize on. And historically, Brondello-led teams have shown tremendous patience in identifying opportunities other organizations create accidentally through pressure. Some fans online have already started speculating about which Fever players could eventually become vulnerable in future roster reshuffling if Indiana's rotation problems continue. Most of that remains pure speculation right now, and no major moves appear imminent. But the conversation itself tells you how quickly concern is growing around this team's long-term structure. Because people aren't just debating wins and losses anymore, they're debating sustainability. Can Indiana realistically survive a full championship push while depending this heavily on a small core group of players? Can the bench develop quickly enough? Can the organization keep pace while rivals quietly strengthen underneath them? And the scariest part for Indiana fans might be this: Toronto doesn't even need to become a super team to create problems. If Sandy Brondello succeeds in building another disciplined, deep, well-balanced roster the same way she did before, the Fever could eventually find themselves battling a rival designed specifically to exploit every weakness they still haven't fixed. For years, Fever fans believed the biggest obstacle standing between the Fever and a championship would eventually be the league's established powers, teams like Las Vegas, New York, maybe even Phoenix, depending on how the roster landscape shifted over time. That's the normal way fans think about title windows. You focus on the giants already sitting at the top of the league. But what if Indiana's most dangerous future rival isn't one of the established super teams at all? What if the real threat is the franchise quietly building underneath the spotlight while everyone else is distracted by Caitlin Clark's rise? Because the more people around the league examine Toronto's early positioning, the more this starts looking less like a standard expansion project and more like the beginning of something intentionally calculated. That's the part Fever fans are slowly starting to realize. Toronto's timeline may actually line up perfectly against Indiana's championship window. While the Fever are trying to accelerate into contention immediately around Caitlin Clark, Toronto has the luxury of studying the league carefully while building from the ground up. There's no overwhelming pressure to win instantly, no nightly national panic cycle, no constant debate shows dissecting every rotation decision. That freedom matters more than people think because it allows an expansion franchise to make smarter long-term choices without forcing moves out of desperation. And if there's one coach people trust to maximize that advantage, it's Sandy Brondello. History is part of why this conversation feels so real already. Brondello's teams don't usually stay irrelevant for long. In Phoenix, the rise happened quickly. In New York, the transformation into a championship contender happened even faster than many expected. That's why some league observers believe Toronto could become competitive much sooner than a normal expansion franchise, not necessarily because they'll land multiple superstars overnight, but because Brondello understands how to build balanced rosters that survive playoff basketball. Smart veteran guards, defensive wings, reliable shooters, role players who understand exactly how to function next to star talent. Those pieces don't always generate headlines immediately, but over time they become the difference between talented teams and championship teams. And honestly, Toronto may already have one advantage Indiana doesn't fully control anymore: patience. The Fever are carrying enormous expectations because the entire basketball world expects Caitlin Clark's arrival to speed everything up. Every loss feels amplified, every roster issue becomes a national discussion, every injury scare creates panic online. That environment can push organizations into rushed decisions without even realizing it. Meanwhile, Toronto gets to operate quietly. They can monitor frustrated players around the league, they can explore international talent, they can develop chemistry without constant media chaos surrounding every move. That kind of stability becomes incredibly valuable when building a contender over several seasons.
There's also the possibility that Toronto eventually becomes attractive to players, specifically because of Brondello's reputation. Veterans around the league know her resume. Players understand the credibility attached to her name. Some online speculation has already suggested that certain role players and international veterans may eventually view Toronto as an ideal situation because of the opportunity to grow within a respected system from the very beginning. None of that guarantees future success, of course. Expansion franchises still face major challenges, but perception matters in professional sports, and right now, Toronto's perception around the league appears to be growing stronger much faster than many expected. The really fascinating part is how differently both organizations could evolve emotionally over the next few years. Indiana's identity is tied directly to a superstar phenomenon. The pressure is immediate, emotional, and public. Toronto's identity may become something completely different, disciplined, patient, and strategically built around depth. And historically, those are exactly the types of teams that become nightmares in playoff basketball. Not always the loudest teams, not always the flashiest, just the ones with the fewest weaknesses by the time postseason basketball arrives. That's why this potential rivalry feels so much bigger than a normal expansion story. It's not just about geography or conference standings. It's about two completely different approaches to building the future of the WNBA colliding at the exact same moment. One franchise trying to carry the weight of unprecedented attention, another quietly assembling pieces behind the scenes while expectations remain lower. And if Sandy Brondello's history tells us anything, it's that people usually underestimate her projects right before they become serious problems for the rest of the league. By the time Indiana and Toronto finally meet with real playoff stakes attached, the battle may already be decided long before tip-off, because championships aren't only won on the court anymore. Sometimes they're won in silent off-season conversations, unnoticed roster decisions, and opportunities other organizations didn't realize they were giving away until somebody else turned them into a contender.
The most unsettling part about all of this for Indiana fans is that there may not be one single moment where everything suddenly falls apart. No dramatic collapse, no giant headline announcing disaster overnight. That's usually not how rivalries like this begin. They build slowly in the background, while nobody notices the warning signs early enough. One waived player here, one missed roster decision there, one expansion franchise quietly collecting overlooked talent while everyone else focuses on the stars. And by the time people finally recognize what's happening, the balance of power has already started shifting underneath them. That's why this conversation around Toronto feels different from a normal expansion story. Most new franchises enter the league hoping to survive, hoping to stay respectable, hoping to maybe compete years down the line. But this situation doesn't feel accidental anymore. When you combine Sandy Brondello's championship resume, her international basketball connections, the flexibility of an expansion roster, and the pressure currently surrounding Indiana, the pieces suddenly start fitting together in a way that has people around the league paying attention much earlier than expected. And whether Fever fans want to admit it or not, the concerns surrounding Indiana's roster depth are becoming impossible to ignore. That doesn't mean Indiana is doomed, far from it. The Fever still have one of the most important young stars basketball has ever seen in Caitlin Clark. They still have national attention, fan support, and a chance to build something special around her. But superstar attention also speeds up the clock. Every weakness becomes visible faster. Every roster mistake becomes louder. Every rival studies your structure more aggressively because they know your championship timeline is already under pressure. And if Indiana doesn't strengthen the roster around Clark carefully, they could eventually create the exact opportunity a smart expansion franchise like Toronto has been waiting for. Because this may never have been about one opening night loss in the first place. It may have been about what that loss revealed: exhaustion, thin rotations, missing depth, questions about long-term stability. Those are the kinds of issues championship organizations attack quietly over time. And historically, Brondello-led teams have shown they know exactly how to capitalize when competitors leave openings available. Maybe Toronto never becomes the powerhouse some fans are already predicting. Expansion franchises are still unpredictable, and much of the speculation surrounding future moves remains exactly that, speculation. But the reason this story keeps gaining attention is because the foundation feels believable. People have seen Sandy Brondello build contenders before. They've seen her identify value other organizations overlooked. They've seen her accelerate timelines faster than expected. And now she's stepping into a conference where Indiana is still trying to survive the pressure surrounding its superstar era. That's why the real battle for the Eastern Conference may already be happening right now behind closed doors, in scouting conversations, in waiver evaluations, in international recruiting calls, in the quiet decisions casual fans never hear about until months later when another roster suddenly looks complete. And if Indiana isn't careful, they may eventually realize the biggest threat to Caitlin Clark's championship future wasn't the dynasty everyone expected. It was the expansion team nobody took seriously soon enough. If you enjoyed this breakdown, let me know in the comments whether you think Indiana is overreacting to early season problems, or if Toronto is quietly building something the rest of the WNBA should already be worried about.